Pursuit of Enemies, Part 1. The new mandate, the winter light over Tel Aviv, was thin and pale, as if the city itself waited for something it could not yet name. Inside a narrow briefing room beneath the intelligence complex, maps were tacked to the walls like wounds. Europe. South America, pockets of exile circled in red. A hush clung to the air. Men and women moved with the deliberate quiet of those who had learned to keep secrets like a second skin. Reuven Shiloah stood at the head of the table, a pale lamp cutting a pool of light across open dossiers. He was no longer a man of speeches. He spoke in sentences that felt like verdicts. Our duty cannot be confined by borders, he told the officers assembled before him. There are men who ordered annihilation and then walked away. They have names. We will find them. The directive that followed from the Prime Minister was precise and unadorned. Identify, locate, secure, return for justice. It carried no clauses about convenience or law. It invoked a moral ledger that had gone unpaid for too long. For Mossad, an institution still young and raw from the fires that birthed the state, the order was the start of a transformation. Intelligence would no longer only defend territory. Its remit would become transnational, surgical, and permanent. In the operations wing, dossiers opened like old wounds. Photographs, ration cards, travel manifests, and faded letters. These became the bones of a hunt. Each piece of paper hinted at a life once lived and a life that had been stolen. Analysts traced names through refugee lists and Red Cross archives, through whisper networks of exiles and priests who kept parish logs. As the threads were pulled, patterns emerged. A surname here, a factory stamp there, a signature identical to one on a wartime roster. The world that had attempted to shed its guilt kept tiny reminders of its crimes in the margins. Among the analysts was Yael Meyer, young and unnervingly steady. She had the look of someone who had made a bargain with memory. Pain would not break her, it would sharpen her purpose. Her own story was folded into the edges of her work. A photograph in her locket was the only tangible trace of a family that had burned. She did not speak much in meetings, but her reports carried a clarity that sank like a blade into cluttered files. When she said a lead was genuine, others listened. A name repeats, she told Shiloah one frosted morning, laying down a paper map stained with ink. Carl Adler sightings in Europe, a movement to Genoa, then a passage to Buenos Aires, the signatures match. It's him. Silence filled the room. The men and women around the table understood the stakes. This was not a simple arrest. It was the opening of a path for a young nation to assert its claim upon history. It was also, quietly, the moment when Mossad would begin to write the doctrine that would guide it for decades. An idea that justice could be pursued across seas, delivered by hands that left no footprints. The Kidon concept began as a whisper, a compact team trained not for grand battles, but for precise, deniable action. It required operatives who could become others, who could speak other tongues, adopt new faces and vanish without a trace. Training was rigorous and uncompromising. Candidates were stripped of familiar comforts. They rehearsed abductions in abandoned warehouses, learned to bypass checkpoints by becoming the kind of person most overlooked, and practiced the fine cruelty of leaving no trace of themselves behind. Yale was selected for Kidon, a choice that felt less like promotion than initiation. The day she received her new papers and her forged identity, Anna Weiss, a German widow traveling for business, she burned the photograph of her childhood in a brief, private ritual. It was not a symbol of forgetting, but a promise. The old self would not impede the mission ahead. Preparation stretched into weeks. Foragers of information combed ports and consulates. Forgers produced passports and transcripts, all textured with a convincing history. Fixers in Berlin and Genoa cultivated the appearances of legitimate commerce. Contacts in Argentina were quietly identified: sympathetic hotel clerks, a dockworker who watched night arrivals, a barber who frequented the same German club as the men suspected of escape. The ethical edges of the campaign were discussed in rooms whose doors were locked. Legal advisors argued for cautious procedures. Diplomats weighed the risks of discovery. Shiloah listened and made decisions that balanced moral urgency and political reality. He knew how a single exposed operation could provoke international outrage and isolate a state already precarious. And yet he also understood the alternative: to allow architects of massacre to live their days in comfort, while survivors carried the memory alone. When the first operatives left Israel, they did so under ordinary names and quieter goodbyes. Families believed them gone on business or further study. The agents did not correct them. In foreign markets and railway stations, Mossad operatives practiced a new craft of blending. Yal's voice on a phone line in Vienna spoke with the measured cadence of a widow. Her eyes recorded every gesture in cafes where old men sipped coffee and tried to pass for quiet citizens. A small ledger from a thrift shop, a notation on a forgotten letter, a half-remembered name mentioned by a priest. These were the tokens of evidence that braided the hunt together. As the network widened, the operations machinery began to hum. Coded transmissions traveled through neutral mail routes, picked up by operatives in safe houses and forwarded to Tel Aviv. Contact couriers wove through ports with unremarkable faces. In the background, a nascent web of intelligence stitched continents together, turning isolated leads into a map that pinpointed hiding places built by shame. There were nights when the moral burden pressed on the planners. Shiloah would walk alone through Jerusalem before dawn, thinking of the thin line between justice and reprisal. He had to ensure that Mossad's actions did not simply mirror the violence it sought to punish. Rules were written in private. Corroborate the facts, spare innocents, never act on vengeance alone. The aim was truth, not theater. Then, one humid afternoon, Yale's dispatch arrived with a certainty that lit the room: Adler, Buenos Aires. New identity confirmed, observation viable. The map on the table gained a single red pin in South America. It was a small mark, but it signified the crossing of an ocean and the extension of a state's moral reach. The silent hunters were no longer a notion, they were an operational force. Their first scent had reached them across hemispheres, and as the agents prepared to move from observation to action, each understood that success would not be celebrated publicly. These were deeds that would be discussed in hushed tones and sealed files. Their triumphs would be silent, their burdens carried alone. But outside, the city continued its ordinary rhythms. Shops opened, waves lapped the shore, life moved forward. But beneath that everyday surface, an agency had altered its course. Mossad had accepted a mission that would define it, to pursue beyond borders and, in the quietest of ways, those who thought they had escaped history. But echoes of vengeance. The city of Tel Aviv wore the thin light of early winter like a shawl. In rooms without view, papers shifted and voices moved quietly, as if the whole place were bending toward the same low-frequency sound, memory. For many of the new operatives, the mandate was not a line on a brief. It was a chord struck against the hollow in their chests. They had come of age with stories of ash, names, and silence. Now that silence demanded action. Yal Meyer moved among stacks of dossiers with the methodical grace of someone who had learned to trace grief to its smallest detail. Each photograph, each ration card, each signature was a map. She could read the tremor in a handwriting sample that others missed. She could look at the angle of a man's collar in a wartime photo and see the uniform he had worn. These were small things that, when stitched together, formed the single thread that could lead them across borders. The debate outside their closed doors was loud and principled. Legal scholars argued that the rule of law was universal and that evidence must be collected, documented, and presented. Diplomats worried about the cost of extraterritorial operations in an era when states still expected certain rules. Shiloah listened to both, and he weighed them against the living testament of the survivors who demanded that the names of their tormentors not be allowed to evaporate into comfortable silence. The agency, however, could not proceed without method. Emotions alone made for dangerous missions. The planners insisted on corroboration, cross-checking, and patient observation. Memory can fuel us, Shiloah told his lieutenants, but method will protect us from becoming what we pursue. They developed a discipline that was half jurisprudence, half craft. Forgers and linguists, historians and field operatives worked together to build cases from the flotsam of a broken continent. Kidon began to take shape, not as a headline, but as a philosophy. The unit's name remained whispered in some corridors, but in practice it meant a compact of specialized skills, tailing without being seen, creating convincing alternate identities, practicing quiet subdual techniques, and constructing extraction routes that left no trace. The spiritual training the unit received was perhaps as important as the physical. Recruits were urged to remember the distinction between justice and revenge, and to hold to it. Yet it was not abstract for Yowell. Her memories were raw and immediate. A photograph in her locket. The smell of a train platform she had never wanted to smell again. When a lead pointed to Carl Adler's possible presence in Buenos Aires, the discovery resonated the way a bell rings in an empty hall. It was one thing to study names in a file. It was another to know that the man who had overseen atrocities might be living in untroubled comfort under a new name. The agency poured resources into small channels. Contacts in refugee communities whispered truths over small cups of bitter coffee. A former Red Cross volunteer in Vienna remembered a man who had changed his name. A parish ledger in Genoa listed a suspicious departure. The intelligence network became a machine for turning half-remembered signs into certainty. Every corroboration hardened the mission into reality. At the same time, the planners understood the fragility of public trust. A mistake would not simply embarrass a young agency. It could cost the fledgling state dearly. Diplomatic exposure could alienate allies and give opponents reasons to paint Israel as a rogue actor. So the method they adopted was surgical: verify, observe, plan, and when action was required, deliver it swiftly and deniably. For the recruits, the training was intense and intimate, a private education in erasure. They learned to change their names and accents to carry forged documents that smelled of travel and history. To move through cafes and docks without leaving a social trace. They rehearsed abductions in warehouses, practiced seduction as a tool for access, and learned that in their line of work, silence was often more powerful than any gunshot. The ethical tensions never fully resolved. Reuven Shiloah walked them like a compass point. He insisted on legal rigor and moral restraint while knowing the deep urge for retribution thrumming beneath it all. He kept the team tight, warned of moral creep, and reminded them that the cause for which they worked must not become indistinguishable from the crimes they pursued. When the confirmation finally arrived, a travel document, a rebuilt passport, a witness account in Buenos Aires, it felt less like triumph than a careful nod from history. The team composed itself. They were to move from the archive into the streets, from observation into a plan that would cross an ocean. The silent hunters braced themselves for work that would not bring applause, only the quiet satisfaction of a ledger balanced. As they prepared, Yao folded a small photograph of her lost family into the palm of her hand and let the memory settle into steel. If the work demanded the sacrifice of their ordinary lives, then so be it. The echo of vengeance that had haunted them would be held in check by the discipline they had forged. They would become instruments, precise, resolute, and, above all, silent. Part 3. The birth of Kidon. The agency forms its first covert strike element: selection, training, and the forging of identities that will erase an operative's past. The birth of Kidon, the idea of Kidon, did not arrive fully formed. It grew from a series of cramped conversations, sketches on the margins of dossiers, and experiments in operational discretion. It had to be more than a team. It had to be a doctrine of absence. The architects believed that the most effective instrument of state retribution was one that left no evidence of its existence. Selection began quietly. Candidates were chosen for temperament as much as skill. Analysts with steady hands and operatives with the nerve for close work were both considered the ideal recruit, possessed the ability to disconnect personal history from mission, to sleep with a false name under his pillow and wake with someone else's accent. They were tested in both simulated fieldwork and in moral endurance. Their capacity to accept the loneliness of secrets was as relevant as their marksmanship. Training took place in a labyrinth of rooms beneath the Mossad compound. There were mock-ups of European apartments, workshops for forging documents, and corridors designed to teach the stealth of movement. Recruits rehearsed the particular art of approaching someone in a market without being noticed, of disabling a single bulb to create a pocket of shadow, and most crucially of disappearing into a crowd when the moment demanded it. At Yale's induction was clinical and intimate. She met instructors who spoke of operational ethics with the same seriousness as they taught chloroform techniques and silent takedowns. The forgers taught her how to make a passport that smelled like travel and age. Linguists worked with her to smooth an accent until it felt natural. She practiced the mechanical cruelty of restraint, a soft cloth across a mouth, a knot tied with competence. The rituals of forgetting were as necessary as the tools themselves. But Kidon also embraced subtler disciplines. Its members learned to manipulate narrative, to feed false leads to local informants, to craft backstories that drew attention away from the true aim, and to create simultaneous distractions that kept watchful eyes busy. Every action was choreographed with alternate stories that would survive scrutiny if the operation was ever under the microscope. The psychological regimen was deliberate. Operatives were counseled in secrecy management, taught to compartmentalize memory, and given methods to absorb trauma so it would not fracture the mission. They were told that the work required a peculiar moral posture, compassion for victims, icy clarity toward perpetrators, and an unwavering commitment to the rules the unit itself set. Mistakes would cost innocence. Zeal untethered from discipline would cost legitimacy. Practical exercises included staged abductions with volunteer actors, long-tailing missions through crowded city districts, and escape drills in varying climates. They practiced loading a body into an unmarked van in 15 seconds, rehearsed the sound of rain on a boat's hull at 2 in the morning, and learned to navigate international waters in the kind of small craft that left little trace. The preparation was exhaustive because the margin for error was microscopic. Outside the training compound, senior planners assembled networks, pilots who could move people on quiet flights, captains willing to sail off the usual charts, and local fixers who could open doors or erase one man's name from a registry. Forgers honed documents that could pass as decades-old passports. Technicians built concealed compartments on boats and in caravans. The operation required a small industry of plausible fabrications. There was always a moral conversation at the center of planning. Shiloah insisted on checks, independent corroboration of guilt, strict rules on collateral harm, and legal advisors who would approve steps when possible. He remained deeply aware of the risk that covert action could be misread as adventurism. The Kidon architects argued back that without secrecy, some perpetrators would live out their days in comfort, while survivors died with unanswered questions. When the first cadre completed training, they did not parade. There was no ceremony. Their induction was a private passing of papers, a sealed file, and a whispered exchange of code names. Yale received instructions that felt like an inheritance and a burden: remain invisible, never speak of the mission, and always remember the line between justice and reprisal. As they readied the plan for Argentina, the Kidon operatives rehearsed the steps repeatedly until motion became habit. The doctrine of absence was internalized. Leave no fingerprints, physical or political. If the world was to be changed by their actions, it would be through subtlety and strain, not through spectacle. And so the birth of Kidon was complete, not in a ceremony, but in quiet rooms, practiced techniques, and the imposition of rules that would, in future years, define an entire approach to clandestine work. The silent hunters had found their instrument. The European Trail, Europe had not yet finished shedding its own recent history. Small towns kept the memory of movement trains, ports, and discreet crossings, and, in those margins, the fugitives had planted roots. The European Trail was a geography of tiny indicators, a notarized transfer, a church record, a ledger entry in a Mediterranean port. To watch the trail was to watch how ordinary systems could be repurposed into escape routes. The mission's early intelligence focused on mapping these banal conduits. Agents spent long weeks in archives, turning pages in dusty municipal offices, comparing handwriting and looking for repeated notations. Each match an identical factory stamp, a recurring signature add a contour to the map of fugitives. There were moments of frustration when a promising lead dissolved into another bureaucratic error. But there were also moments of sudden clarity that made the work feel like the slow solving of a giant, cruel puzzle. Yale's work in Europe tested patience. She watched a man in Genoa who traded in ship manifests, a clerk who prepared transit papers but seemed to prefer cash under the table. She cultivated small confidences with priests and tailors, with the kind of people whose livelihoods touched strangers and could whisper details without anyone noticing. The network in Europe required finesse, the kind that moved information without creating noise. In Rome, a retired official remembered seeing a wealthy German family that had arrived with an impeccably trained housekeeper. In Vienna, a seamstress described altering uniforms for men who no longer wanted to be recognized. The agents compiled these fragments, cross-referenced them with passenger lists and harbor logs, and began to draw trajectories that pointed not just across the continent, but toward one port of departure, Genoa. Genoa, with its ancient docks and long lines of arriving ships, was a magnet. It was there the trail often narrowed, where a forged manifest and a discreet bribe could move a passenger onto a vessel bound for the New World. The team monitored shipping schedules, measured the comings and goings of certain steamers, and identified captains who might be persuaded to carry one more passenger for a price or a favor. In the margins of legitimate commerce, the fugitives found passage. The agents practiced a different kind of surveillance in Europe. Instead of dramatic tales through crowded city squares, they often followed the quiet, patient work of bureaucracy. They waited in municipal corridors for afternoon clerks to finish their paperwork. They sat through Sunday masses to hear whispered names, and they traced the paper trails of small businesses that occasionally served as fronts. The chase was slow, but it was meticulous, and it required the patience to listen when the world spoke in understatement. At times, the trail grew dangerous. Local sympathizers men who had not shed their old loyalties moved within these networks. In certain cafes, a misplaced glance could signal recognition. On a train platform, a hand gesture could warn of surveillance. The operatives learned to turn ordinary human behavior into code, to interpret a pause in speech as likely suspicion. Their skills matured in the difficult terrain of human signals. As the web in Europe tightened, the map began to point south. Letters and travel logs suggested a pattern, routes that converged on Genoa and then traversed the Atlantic to ports in South America. The agents began to suspect that many had not only chosen exile, but had built communities abroad that provided cover social clubs, small businesses, and churches where old allegiances could be revived and new lives could be constructed. But when the pieces finally aligned and a pattern of movement suggested an Argentine destination, Tel Aviv prepared to close the loop. The silent hunters had traced a path that led across continents and oceans. The agency assembled the plan to follow it to the final point where the past and the present would meet, and where justice would require all the quiet precision they had learned. The web of deception in a small apartment overlooking the dim harbor of Buenos Aires. The air smelled faintly of sea salt and cigarette smoke. The operatives had gathered in silence, their expressions carved with tension and exhaustion. On the table lay a single photograph, grainy, black and white, showing Karl Adler stepping out of a German expatriate club. The face was older, heavier, but unmistakable. The man who had once ordered the deportation trains now wore fine suits and entertained businessmen beneath the tropical sun. Yoel studied the image without blinking. Months of surveillance had built to this, a confirmed identity, a routine, and a narrow window of vulnerability. The team's handler, known only as Levi, paced slowly behind her. His voice was quiet but absolute. No mistakes, no noise. He vanishes from the world. But no one must know how. The plan required precision, a 3-minute extraction on a public street. A false car service, falsified travel papers, and an air route through a neutral country. The Argentine police were not to be involved. Political risk was too high. A single misstep could expose Mossad's presence in South America, endangering all future operations. At dawn, Yao walked the target's route. The streets were slick from an early rain, reflecting yellow light from flickering lamps. She timed every step, memorized escape paths, and marked where a vehicle could stop without attracting attention. Each movement was rehearsed like choreography, calm, calculated, human. In espionage, invisibility was not about hiding, it was about appearing ordinary. The night before the operation, a storm rolled across the city. Thunder shuddered through the harbor, waves breaking against the concrete piers. In their safe house, the operatives checked their equipment one last time. Sedatives, binding straps, disguises, exit documents. Each item felt both mundane and heavy with implication. They were not soldiers, they were architects of silence. When the hour came, the streets were empty. The car idled by the curb, its driver reading a newspaper. Yale stood at the corner, her breath steady. Adler appeared precisely at 8. Umbrella in hand, coat collar turned up against the wind. As he stepped toward the waiting vehicle, Yowell gave a subtle nod. The rear door opened, a brief motion, almost polite. Within seconds, Adler was guided inside, his mouth covered, a needle pressed to his neck. By the time the car turned the corner, he was unconscious. The extraction unfolded with clockwork precision. The team drove through the port's service lanes, bypassing guards who recognized the forged credentials. In less than 30 minutes, Adler was secured in a warehouse, monitored by a physician who ensured his condition remained stable. From there, the next stage began, a transfer aboard a cargo vessel with a concealed compartment. Bound for Israel under a false manifest. But as the team exhaled, believing the hardest part done, a single error rippled outward. A dockworker had noticed the license plate, an irregularity he later mentioned to a local inspector, who happened to have ties to the German expatriate network. Within hours, whispers began to spread across Buenos Aires. A man had been taken. In Tel Aviv, Shiloah received the coded message. Package secured. Possible exposure. His reply was simple. Proceed. Silence all trails. The tone was not cruel, only resolute. The mission could not collapse now. Mossad's credibility depended on its ability to bring Adler to justice without leaving the faintest trace of its hand. Meanwhile, in Argentina, the press began to murmur about the sudden disappearance of a foreign businessman. No names, no evidence, only questions. The local authorities hesitated. There was no body, no witness, no crime to investigate. Within days, the story faded into rumor, swallowed by the city's usual rhythm of noise and forgetfulness. Aboard the vessel, Adler awoke briefly, confused, restrained, disoriented. Yale was their expression unreadable. "You will answer for what you did," she said softly, not in anger, but in inevitability. The prisoner's response was a whisper of denial that dissolved into silence. By the time they reached the open sea, he had fallen asleep again, sedated by a stronger dose. Yael looked out over the dark Atlantic. The waves stretched endlessly toward the horizon, cold, unfeeling, ancient. For a moment, she wondered what would remain of her humanity after this mission. Every act of justice required a sacrifice, and hers was becoming invisible, piece by piece. When the ship finally docked under the pale dawn of Haifa, the team dispersed like smoke. Officially, the man known as Karl Adler no longer existed. Unofficially, history had gained one more secret that would never make it into textbooks. In a quiet office, Shilowa wrote a single line in his private ledger. "The first has been delivered." The hunt continues. Shadows in the capital, in the grey corridors of Jerusalem's government compound. The air had changed. The successful capture and quiet transfer of Karl Adler was never meant to be public. Yet, somehow, fragments of the story had begun to leak across Europe, in diplomatic cables and whispered meetings. Words like kidnapping, extradition, and unofficial justice surfaced like ghosts in polite conversation. The operation that had been Mossad's silent triumph now threatened to become a political storm. Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion sat in his dim office, a single lamp burning over a desk stacked with reports. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. Across from him stood Reuven Shilowa, posture stiff, hat in hand. "They're calling it illegal abduction," Ben-Gurion said quietly. "Argentina demands answers. The Americans are watching. Even our friends in Europe are nervous." Shilowa nodded once. "And yet," he replied, "the world knows who Adler was. They will not mourn him. They only fear the precedent that we can reach anywhere." The Prime Minister leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "Then we must learn to make the world fear us, but never prove it." That sentence would become an unspoken commandment inside Mossad, across the city, in a safe house hidden behind an antique shop. Yael and her surviving team members waited for debrief. The room smelled of dust and oil, its only decoration a world map riddled with pins. They had returned without ceremony. No medals, no official welcome, not even real names on their travel documents. They were ghosts in their own country. Levi entered without knocking, his coat still wet from the evening rain. He placed a file on the table. "Congratulations," he said dryly. "Your faces are erased. Your work denied." "You did well," Yael gave a faint smile, "and Adler under guard. The trial will be quiet. No headlines. Justice doesn't always require applause, but beneath the calm surface, ripples were spreading. In Buenos Aires, German exile communities whispered of Israeli agents operating in secret. In London and Paris, intelligence chiefs debated how far the new agency in Tel Aviv was willing to go. And in Washington, officials drafted reports suggesting that Mossad's reach had become a matter of concern and respect. Meanwhile, within Mossad itself, a transformation began. The Kidon unit, once a temporary assembly of agents, was now being formalized into a permanent strike branch, small, precise, deniable. Training expanded, recruitment grew more selective. The operatives were taught to disappear inside cultures, to mimic languages and loyalties, to kill without question, but only when absolutely necessary. In the midst of this evolution, Yael found herself restless. She had achieved what she thought she wanted, justice, yet it had left no peace behind. Every night, the faces of those she hunted returned in her dreams, not as monsters, but as men. Mossad called them enemies, but in private she wondered whether vengeance had begun to shadow their cause. One evening, as she walked through the narrow streets of the old city, a voice called her name softly. It was Shiloah. He had come without entourage, his face weary but kind. They sat on a stone bench overlooking the quiet city lights. "You did what few could," he told her. "You carried out history's will." Yael shook her head. "History's will feels heavy, sir. It doesn't let you sleep." He looked out toward the horizon. "That's the price of silence. The world forgets easily. We cannot." In the weeks that followed, Mossad faced its first true test of secrecy. Argentina filed diplomatic protests demanding explanations for Adler's disappearance. International journalists began connecting dots. A vanished Nazi official, whispers of Israeli agents, anonymous sightings near the docks. The government denied everything, issuing calm statements about false rumors. The diplomats lied smoothly. Mossad erased paper trails with surgical precision. But the cracks were visible. Friendly nations began to question the boundaries of Israeli operations. The agency was forced to shift tactics to become less visible, more layered, more deceptive. But for every operative on the ground, 3 more would now work in shadows, planting misdirection, falsifying footprints, and ensuring that no line could ever be traced back to the heart of Tel Aviv. As this machine of deception grew, so did the moral complexity. Within the agency, debates erupted quietly about how far justice could reach before it became something else. Some officers wanted restraints, others argued for absolute pursuit. Shiloah, standing at the center, knew he had birthed something larger than control. Mossad was no longer just a shield. It had become a sword sharpened by ghosts. One rainy night, Yael received a sealed envelope with no sender's name. Inside was a single message, typed in precise English. "If Adler was one, there are 20 more. Berlin, Rome, Damascus." She stared at the note for a long time. The world map in her mind began to shift again. The hunt was far from over, and deep down she realized that this would be her life now, tracing shadows across continents, balancing justice and secrecy in a world that preferred both to remain unseen. The silent hunters had proven their existence. Now they had to live with what they had become. Operation Shadownet. Operation Shadownet began like a spider spinning a web, slowly, invisibly, thread by thread. After Buenos Aires, Mossad understood that single captures did not end a network, they only revealed its edges. The agency needed not only hunters, but a permanent infrastructure of contacts, safe houses, and local assets that could be activated anywhere instantly. The plan was to seed influence, a mesh of deniable operatives, sympathetic fixers, and forged institutions that could conceal movement and manufacture plausible covers. Reuven Shiloah authorized a long-range project, establish cells across Europe and South America, under the guise of cultural associations, import-export businesses, and charities. These entities would provide everything an operative might need: bank accounts, employment records, rental agreements, and plausible backstories. For each new cover, a chain of corroborating documents was created and buried in the bureaucratic soil of municipal offices, clerks, and embassy attachés. The web would not be a single line that could be traced. It would be a lattice of mutually reinforcing lies. Yale found herself moving from fieldwork into orchestration. Her nights, once consumed by months of tailing and single-target surveillance, were now filled with meetings in rooms where accents were swapped like hats, and legal advisors argued about risk mitigation. She oversaw the forging team's vetted local contacts and rehearsed contingencies with pilots and captains ready to move people on short notice. The artistry of deceit required precision: forge a birth certificate that matched a dentist's record. Have a postman in Genoa deliver a letter that proved residency, small, ordinary things that, stacked together, created truth. But as the mesh grew, so did exposure. Unintended interactions between cells produced patterns. A dock worker who had been paid for small favors in one port now happened to see suspicious crates in another city. A sympathetic priest in a German club passed an offhand comment to a visiting friend. Human networks, even covert ones, leak. The agency accepted this risk, but aimed to minimize it by compartmentalizing knowledge and limiting contacts. Each cell knew only enough to do its part. No one held the whole map. The first serious warning came when a trusted fixer in Mossad reported meetings that did not fit the scheduled patterns. Someone had been asking questions, polite, precise, probing about innocent-seeming details. Where did foreign steamers dock? Which captains preferred cash? Which warehouses had flexible manifests? The questions were subtle, but the pattern suggested someone building a mirror-image intelligence picture. Mossad's analysts noted the cadence. It felt like surveillance of surveillance. Inside the agency, suspicion hardened into a hunt of a different kind. If someone was quietly mapping Mossad's mesh, that person could unravel operations across 3 continents. The possibility of an insider leak forced a strategy shift. Teams were ordered to tighten their compartments. Couriers were rerouted, some safe houses were abandoned and replaced overnight. The agency treated the leak as a higher-order target. Find the leak before the leak found them. Paranoia is corrosive. Quiet accusations ricocheted through the halls. Operatives who had trained together for years watched one another with guarded eyes. Even Yael felt the change. Colleagues she had trusted became strangers with files. Old camaraderie became tactical distance. The emotional price of secrecy now revealed itself. Trust was a commodity that melted under suspicion. The most painful discovery was not a single traitor, but a small cluster of compromises. An embittered fixer had sold information to the highest bidder for cash. A local police contact, sympathetic to the expatriate community, had been tipping certain movements. A forger, once detained, had talked too long to neighbors. None of these betrayals were grand conspiracies. They were human failures: greed, fear, exhaustion. Yet the effect was the same. The net had holes. Mossad responded with surgical measures. Compromised nodes were neutralized, not always with violence, but through legal and social means. A businessman's license mysteriously revoked. A club's chair quietly persuaded to leave the country. A port inspector reassigned under moral pressure. In each instance, the agency chose solutions that left no fingerprints. The goal was to restore the lattice while keeping the world unaware that it had ever been weakened. Finally, a clearer threat surfaced. Intelligence from a reluctant foreign contact indicated that a European security service had begun collating reports on unusual removals and plausible Israeli links. They were not accusing publicly, but the intelligence suggested coordination among different networks, a risk that could escalate if mishandled. Shiloah convened a small emergency council and decided on a counter-operation: create a false trail that would lead any curious investigator down an empty corridor, plant decoy documents, stage a false lead that ended in an unremarkable bureaucratic dead end, and make sure the noises masked the real movements. Operation Shadownet thus evolved into a chessboard of deliberate misdirection. While one set of operatives tightened the lattice, another set created illusions. The aim was to be unreadable. When someone tried to trace a pattern, they would find only ordinary commerce, predictable paperwork, and plausible coincidences. Mossad's greatest weapon was turning its own opacity into a mirror that reflected nothing. Yale watched this unfold with a mixed sense of accomplishment and unease. The mesh could protect hunts and accelerate captures, but the cost in human relationships, in moral wear, felt steep. She had become part of a net that sheltered justice, but also smothered ordinary life in precaution. In the quiet moments, she asked herself whether an agency that depended on lies to prevent crimes would one day be judged by the very standard it had set. Nevertheless, ShadowNet worked. It allowed quick mobilization for future missions, made ad hoc exfiltration smoother, and reduced collateral noise. The web's success would be proven within weeks when a different hunt, a more dangerous target in Rome, would use the same lattice to trap a man whose public face masked a monstrous past. The lesson was simple and terrible. In the realm of silence, infrastructure mattered more than heroics. The night of the hunt roam at night had a peculiar softness. Its ancient stones held echoes of centuries, and its lanes absorbed sound like memory. For the Mossad team, those same streets were a battlefield of patience. The target was an engineer named Marcus Vogel, a man who had retooled wartime expertise into post-war industry and had vanished into municipal respectability. Vogel's public life shielded a secret. During the war, he had supervised transports to death camps. The web of evidence assembled by analysts and local informants had finally narrowed to his apartment on the Via del Bottega. The dossier called for an operation of speed and near-surgical calm. The team in Rome included veterans from Buenos Aires and newly inducted Kidon operatives who had proven their steadiness in rehearsals. Yal was not in the front line this time. She coordinated from a safe house, listening to radio channels and watching feeds from concealed cameras. Her role had shifted from hunter to conductor. The plan was straightforward on paper. Intercept Vogel on his routine evening walk, subdue him without bloodshed, and move him through a chain of safe houses to a coastal extraction point where a fishing boat would take him to a rendezvous with a neutral cargo vessel. The mission hinged on timing. A single delay could invite discovery and spark an international incident. On the chosen night, the city seemed complicit in silence. The team dispersed into their assigned positions, tails at a distance. A distraction set near a cafe, a vehicle waiting at a shadowed alley. A young operative, Amir, played the part of a lost tourist who asked for directions near Vogel's route, creating a brief bustle that would thin the street of genuine witnesses. As Vogel stepped into the planned trap, the tail tightened. What the team had underestimated was the improvisational fabric of human life. A stray dog darted into the path, scattering a group of late-night strollers. A street vendor startled, dropping crates that burst open with noisy fruit. The world intruded. In the confusion, the first attempt at a silent subdual went awry. Vogel struggled. He was stronger than he looked. The scuffle drew attention. A neighbor stepped onto a balcony and began shouting, his voice ricocheting down the alley. The team's rehearsed calm dissolved into controlled urgency. One operative, a veteran named Dove, made a split-second decision. He used a short, hard blow to the temple to silence Vogel. The man slumped, unconscious, but alive. The blow was calculated. It was also violent in a way the Kidon doctrine tried to avoid. They moved quickly, carrying their burden through back streets, past shuttered shops and sleeping dogs. The adrenaline of close contact left traces sweat, a smear of dust on a sleeve. At a narrow stairwell, an unexpected patrol of municipal police turned the corner. The team's forged credentials and the actor's distraction were their only shield. Heartbeats hammered. The officer glanced, suspicious, then turned away. The moment bled into silence. Inside the safe house, Vogel regained consciousness, groggy and frightened. The operatives explained in curt, firm language that his life would be taken not by spectacle, but by the slow process that the state now claimed as its duty. He protested, sputtered denials, begged for lawyers. In that room, surrounded by strangers, the weight of his past pressed on him like a physical thing. The agents' faces were unreadable as they administered sedatives and bound him for travel. Yet, as they prepared to move, intelligence came through. The target's name had been noted hours earlier by a local informant with connections to a different clandestine group, an organization sympathetic to those who had fled Europe. They would be galvanized once they realized a high-profile figure had been taken. The team accelerated, cutting the planned route and taking a riskier path to reach the coast sooner. At the docks, a tense exchange unfolded. A weather front had arrived earlier than forecasted. The fishing boat designated for extraction rocked with more vigor than expected. The sea can swallow many things, but it also revealed them to those who watched. A port inspector, keeping hours he normally would not, raised his binoculars at the wrong moment. For the second time that night, the team's luck was tested. The captain bargained with fate and speeded the engine. They slipped between piers with skill born of practice until the mainland lights receded and the horizon absorbed them. On the boat, in the motionless dark, the operatives allowed themselves a moment to breathe. The mission had cost more improvisation than planned. It had cost a blow that left a mark and a near encounter with law. Yet they had succeeded. Marcus Vogel was under Mossad custody, bound for questioning that would test what secrecy and method could yield when stacked against a man's memory of atrocity. Yael listened to the radio silent stretch, then wrote a brief note in her log. Operational success. Costs noted. Review tactics. The words were clinical, but beneath them lay a question that would not quiet. Had the doctrine of deniability drifted toward brutality in moments of pressure? The answer would take months of internal debates, but for that night the priority was survival and delivery. They had pushed Kidon's limits and found both its strengths and its fractures. The night of the hunt had been messy, human, and necessary. It left them with the expensive knowledge that control is a fragile thing when faced with the messy chaos of life, and with the commitment to refine their craft until they could operate with precision even when life itself refused to cooperate. The flight of shadows, the success of capture, is only the beginning. Extraction is where victory turns precarious. Taking a man across borders without igniting global attention is a logistical riddle and a political gambit. For Mossad, the flight of shadows required not only craft, but a capacity to manipulate official channels just enough to pass unnoticed. The plan for Vogel's return was elaborate. A neutral cargo ship would take him to a friendly coastal state, where a civilian airline with a clandestine manifest would carry him to a discreet airstrip in the Mediterranean. From there, a small military transport, quietly convinced by diplomatic whispers, would deliver him to Israel. Every transfer posed a risk. Any civilian official or crew member who chose conscience over complicity could unravel the entire chain. Yael coordinated with pilots who had flown under improvised manifests and captains who understood how to let a vessel seem ordinary. while hiding compartments beneath crates of imported goods. The forgery department produced a passenger manifest that included nuns and merchants as covers. The medical team prepared sedatives and simulated ailments. Dov and Amir rode point, their faces drawn and precise. As the cargo ship neared the rendezvous port, the mood aboard tightened. Crews weaved daily routines into the choreography of concealment, engine checks, supposedly routine communications that had hidden meanings, and watchful eyes in the rigging. Onshore, local fixers prepared false paperwork to grease port authorities. They paid what had to be paid, negotiated what needed negotiation, and arranged for the quiet release of a man who carried a past heavier than his passport. The first leg proceeded with deceptive normalcy. At a station, the team executed a switch. Vogel's identity folded into a shipment manifest as a benign nonentity. A clerical error, a mislabeled container, a man sleeping among sacks of grain. The illusion held until an unforeseen inspection by a customs official triggered a tense pause. A bribe, a persuasive conversation, and a forged stamp later. The ship slipped away. Everyone breathed, but only a little. On the flight segment, the team faced the most delicate moment. Civilian aviation is layered with paperwork, passenger logs, and customs declarations. To move a man across sovereign airspace without raising an alarm required more than forged names. It required a believable human story. Vogel was described as a retired industrial consultant returning to Israel to settle affairs. The airline's manifest was smooth, the seats filled with actors who would later corroborate the tale if questioned. Over the course of these movements, whispers traveled through diplomatic circuits. An embassy official in a transit country received a quiet warning. "We are aware of movements of interest." The message was purposefully ambiguous, a test of whether the state would protest publicly or quietly. Look the other way. The silence that followed was the tacit permission Mossad relied upon. International politics is often a language of not saying. When the plane finally took off toward the covert airstrip, Yale watched the feed of static-strewn radio channels. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine public gratitude, public truth. Then she dismissed it. Their victories were not for newspapers. They were ledger adjustments in a book no one would read. The plane crossed borders like a thought, and the team held their breath until the small military transport touched down within Israeli control. Delivering Vogel into Israeli custody was a procedural triumph and a moral turning point. In a secure facility, interrogators began the painstaking process of reconstruction. Documents, witness cross-checks, and the slow conversation that would either convict a man or reveal the limits of memory and evidence. The state would decide how much to disclose, weighing legal outcomes against diplomatic fallout. International reaction was predictable. Rumors mutated into whispers in foreign ministries. Op-eds debated the ethics of extraterritorial abductions. Some voices hailed Mossad's resolve. Others warned of a dangerous precedent. The diplomatic corps went to work, denials offered in public, bland statements of respect for sovereignty, and private conversations that smoothed feathers. Mossad learned the contours of plausible deniability once again. For the operatives, the flight of shadows left scars that were less visible but deeper. The strain of inventing identities, of manipulating institutions, and of holding secrets peeled away parts of themselves. Dav, who had struck Vogel in Rome, found sleep slippery. The rhythm of his nights changed. Amir carried the memory of a near confrontation with a customs inspector. He had a new habit of returning to the same cafe at odd hours just to memorize normalcy. Yao recorded their resilience and warned of the slow erosion of moral clarity that could follow. Yet, even amid fatigue, there was a grim satisfaction. A man who had once ordered trains now faced interrogation in a secure room. For survivors and their families who had waited decades, the act, secret, complex, and dangerous, felt like a measure of closure. That closure was private, painful, and imperfect. It came at the cost of many small deceptions and the steady loosening of ordinary certainties. The flight of shadows taught Mossad a cruel lesson. Extraction is as much a political operation as a logistical one. It required not only forgers and pilots, but statesmen who could mute the noise. It required allies who understood the moral calculus enough to keep their mouths closed. And it required operatives ready to shoulder the loneliness of deeds done in the dark. When the logs were filed and the false manifests tucked away, Shiloh penned another line in his ledger. Delivered, lessons noted, mesh strengthened. The silent hunters had moved a man from one shore to another, reasserting an idea that would haunt the diplomatic world for years. That some justice would be taken quietly, and some secrets would remain the price of survival. Legacy of the hunters, the sun was setting over Tel Aviv, casting long orange streaks across the Mediterranean Sea, in the quiet office of the Mossad headquarters. Yael sat before a window, her reflection merging with the horizon. Years of silence, sacrifice, and shadows had etched themselves into her face. The war she had fought wasn't the kind told in history books. It was one hidden behind code names and erased identities. Files lay scattered on her desk. Names of men who had once ruled through fear, now crossed out in red ink. Each name represented a mission. A ghost of justice served without applause. The agency had changed. The hunters who once moved in the dark had become legends whispered about even among allies. Levi entered silently, carrying 2 cups of black coffee. "You ever think about what we've become?" he asked, setting a cup beside her. Yael didn't look up. "Hunters," she replied softly. "And sometimes the hunted." He smiled faintly. "You know, they'll never thank us." "But they shouldn't," she said. "The world sleeps because people like us stay awake." Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the silent wars fought in its name. New recruits were arriving, trained in modern surveillance, digital espionage, and the unseen art of cyber warfare. But the spirit of Mossad remained unchanged: precision, patience, and purpose. As Yarel walked down the corridor one last time, her footsteps echoed like the ghosts of every operation before. She paused by a wall lined with empty frames, a memorial for unnamed heroes. No faces, no dates, only the words carved in Hebrew for those who existed but never worked. Reuven Shilawa's photograph hung at the end, the founder whose dream had birthed this hidden empire. His words from long ago came back to her. Power means nothing unless guided by silence. Yael placed her hand over the frame, then turned away. The next generation would take her place, hunting new enemies born of a changing world, not Nazis or fascists this time, but threats hidden in circuits, data, and deception. Yet the mission remained the same: protect the unseen, strike before danger becomes real. As the night deepened, Mossad's offices came alive. Encrypted transmissions flickered on screens. Agents vanished into the world under new identities, and somewhere in a desert training facility, recruits were taught the old creed. You will never be known, but your work will speak in silence. The world outside would never understand the cost of such duty. Mossad's hunters were not heroes. They were instruments of a fragile peace, invisible, unsung, and eternal. Yael walked into the night, blending once more into the city's pulse. The sea whispered behind her, and for a brief moment she felt peace, not the peace of victory, but of completion. The mission was done, and thus ended the first era of Mossad's silent hunters, an era of vengeance. Justice and the quiet burden of those who serve history from the shadows. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of silence, the power of justice, and the courage of the unseen, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Spyward Story. This was The Silent Hunters, Mossad's Global Pursuit of Enemies, a glimpse into the secret world of intelligence and espionage. Stay tuned for our next journey, where another hidden chapter of spy history will unfold. This is Spyward Story, and the shadows are never empty.